You ever hear a story so wild it makes your jaw drop and your blood boil at the same time? This one's about my dad, the nicest, most patient man you'd ever meet until a brutal gang beat him nearly to death. What happened next wasn't just payback. It was calculated, cold-blooded revenge, and it changed everything. My dad wasn't the kind of guy you'd expect to have a revenge story. If you met him, you'd think he was just your average blue-collar guy, quiet, friendly, patient as a saint. He'd lend you a wrench, fix your car, and never ask for anything in return. But underneath all that calm was a steel spine, and a temper that, once triggered, could scare off a wild animal. Growing up, I never saw him lose his cool, not once. He'd get annoyed, sure, maybe mutter something under his breath when the dishwasher broke again, or when someone cut him off in traffic. But he didn't explode, he didn't shout, he just handled it. That's what made what he told me years later so chilling. It all came out one night, after I told him about the tricks I'd pulled on my mother before moving out. We laughed about it, the gnomes, the laxative stunt, the petty chaos. Then he got quiet. His smile faded. He stared off like he was remembering something long buried. And then he said, "You think that was bad? Let me tell you what I did back in '78. I knew from the tone of his voice that this wasn't a story he told often. In fact, he made it clear it was the only time he ever said it out loud. He even made me promise I'd never do anything like what he did. I'm not proud of it," he said, "but I don't regret it either. My dad came from tough stock. My grandfather worked in the city dump, which didn't exactly pay well, but it gave my dad an early education in making do with nothing. He grew up fixing broken junk, turning trash into treasure, and learning to survive in a place that didn't hand you a damn thing. By the time he was in his early 20s, Dad was striking out on his own. He'd gotten a partial scholarship to a community college, just enough to keep him afloat, and worked at the graveyard shift at a gas station to pay rent. His apartment, a dump in the worst part of town, but it was his dump, and he was proud of that. The area, though, was crawling with trouble. Gangs, drug deals, and punks with nothing better to do. And unfortunately, some of those punks were familiar faces, guys from high school who never grew up, never moved on. One in particular stood out, Ted. Ted was the kind of bully you'd see in an '80s. Dumb, angry, and always looking for a weaker target. And my dad, well, in high school, he'd been that target. Ted hated him, always had. Maybe it was because my dad didn't stoop to his level. Or maybe it was because when Ted flunked out, my dad graduated and moved on with his life. That kind of thing eats at a guy like Ted. Now that they were adults, you'd think things would be different. But Ted hadn't changed. He had gotten meaner, more desperate, and he had a crew of losers just like him hanging around that apartment complex. At first, they tagged my dad's car his pride and joy, a beat-up '68 Chevy Nova with spray paint. Then came the jeers, the intimidation, the late-night harassment when he'd come home from class or work. My dad ignored it all. He kept his head down, didn't respond, didn't escalate, just kept living his life, hoping they'd get bored and move on. They didn't. And one night, they made sure he'd never forget them. That was the night they jumped him in an alley behind his building just a few steps from his front door. Ted and his gang beat him until he stopped moving. Until he stopped breathing, almost. He woke up in a hospital bed days later, bones broken, head wrapped in gauze, memory fuzzy like a scrambled signal. He was told he'd been found by an old lady walking her dog the next morning. If she hadn't spotted him, he might have died in that alley. Just another body in a city that didn't care. The police came. My dad named names. He said it was Ted. Everyone knew it was Ted, but the cops, no witnesses, alibis, nothing we can do. That was the moment something inside him snapped. That fire he kept buried deep down, hidden beneath all that patience and kindness, it caught flame. And once it did, there was no turning back. He didn't get mad, he got methodical. And what he did next, well, that's when the story really begins. Ted wasn't born angry, he was made that way. Or at least that's how my dad saw it. The guy had always been a bruiser, even back in middle school. The kind of kid who'd knock your books out of your hand just because he could. But in high school, that cruelty sharpened into something darker, something meaner. Dad and Ted weren't friends, not ever. Ted was one of those guys who peaked to a star of the football team, walking the halls like he owned them. He had size, he had swagger, and he had a posse of meatheads who followed him around like ducks. But when senior year came around, all that glory started to slip away. Ted's grades tanked. He'd skated by on brute force and backslaps from coaches who needed him on the field. But eventually, even they couldn't cover for him. When the school finally cracked down, Ted was benched. No football, no status, and that was the beginning of the end. My dad, he wasn't a jock, wasn't flashy, but he was smart, quiet, kept his head down, and did the work. His grades were solid enough to land a partial scholarship, not much, but enough to open a door, and that drove Ted nuts. Watching someone he used to push around move forward while he stayed stuck in the mud. That was more than Ted could take. After Ted dropped out, he disappeared for a while. Rumors swirled. Some said he was dealing, others said he was in and out of juvie for petty stuff fights, stealing, drug charges that never stuck. Wherever he went, trouble followed. But the worst part, he never really left. Not mentally. He stayed in that high school headspace, still thinking he could intimidate, still needing to feel like the big dog. So when Ted saw my dad again, years later now, living on his own, studying, working, trying to build something, those old feelings came rushing back. Resentment, jealousy, rage. It started small, little things. Trash left on his car, mocking him from across the street, blocking the entrance to the building with their bodies when Dad came home late from class. Ted and his new crew of losers, none of them doing anything with their lives, just hanging around, waiting to feel powerful again. My dad tried to ignore it, he really did. For weeks he'd take the long way around the block to avoid them. He stopped driving the Nova for a while because he didn't want to see it trashed again. He even reported them to the landlord, but you can guess how far that got it. In a neighborhood like that, complaints didn't mean much. But the thing about resentment is, it doesn't stop until it finds blood. And one night it did. That alley behind the apartment wasn't, well, just a flickering streetlight and the occasional shadow of a passing cat. It was late, probably close to midnight. My dad had just gotten off work, tired, his backpack slung over one shoulder, thinking only about a hot shower and maybe some sleep before morning classes. He never saw them coming. Ted and his boys stepped out from behind a dumpster like they were waiting for a cue. No words, just fists, boots, pain. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution. My dad went down hard. He remembered the first punch, maybe the second. After that, it was just blackness. When he woke up days later in the hospital, everything hurt. His ribs were cracked, one arm in a cast, a concussion that made the ceiling spin every time he blinked. And worst of all, he knew exactly who did it, but no one cared. The police asked questions, took his statement, then shrugged. No witnesses, alibis checked out, no fingerprints. That was it. Ted walked. Again, you'd think that would break a person. Some people would have packed their bags, given up on school, moved back home. But not my dad. Something changed in him. A coldness, a resolve. It wasn't rage, it was clarity. He told me he'd spent his whole life trying to stay on the right side of the line. But sometimes, the line moves. And when that happens, you either step back or you step forward. He chose forward. With his body still healing and his college plans on hold. He moved in with a friend, someone who owed him a favor and shared a similar fire in his chest. They didn't talk much about what they were planning. Didn't need to. A few nods, a few late-night whispers, and the gears started turning. Ted had crossed a line, and my dad, he was about to erase the whole damn thing. Because for every action, there's a consequence. And for Ted, the consequence was coming fast, and it was riding a bicycle made of broken dreams and borrowed anger. The thing about violence is it lingers, not just on your body, but in your bones. It stains your thoughts. My dad didn't just heal from that alleyway attack, he endured it. Every scar was a reminder, a promise, a silent oath, that it wasn't over, not by a long shot. He'd told me that the days in the hospital were a blur. Nurses checking his vitals, doctors rattling off procedures, and friends visited, but few knew what to say. Most avoided asking how it happened, and the ones who did, they already knew. It was always Ted. It had always been Ted. My dad couldn't talk much the first few days. His jaw was swollen, ribs wrapped tight. He couldn't sit up without groaning, but he listened. To the police, to the doctors, to the disappointment in their voices when they said, "Sorry, but there's nothing we can do." That stuck with him. The cops didn't try very hard. They wrote down some notes, interviewed the neighbors, none of whom had seen anything, and then moved on. Case closed, no arrests, no charges. Ted and his crew were free to hang out on the same stoop, drinking cheap beer, throwing glances up at my dad's apartment window like they knew they'd gotten away with it because, well, they had. My dad spent nearly 3 months recovering. 3 months watching his partial scholarship slip away, his classes marked as incomplete, and the world keep turning like nothing happened. That was the worst part, not the pain, not the humiliation, but the silence, no justice, no reckoning. And yet, he never said a word to them, never so much as looked their way. He moved out of that apartment as soon as he could. A buddy of his, same guy, backyard ramps and go-karts with as a kid offered him a spare room in a rundown 3-story building a few neighborhoods over. It wasn't much, but it had something the last place didn't. Opportunity. The opportunity to disappear and re-emerge as something far more dangerous. My dad and his friend, let's call him Rick, were cut from the same cloth. Handy, quiet, resourceful. They'd grown up in the same junkyard playground, taught by my grandfather how to make something from nothing. While other kids were chasing girls or playing ball, these two were wiring batteries to light bulbs, fixing rusted-out radios, and building homemade slingshots out of broken chairs. So when my dad told Rick what happened, how Ted had beaten him nearly to death, and how the cops had shrugged it off, Rick didn't ask, "Are you sure you want to do this?" He just said, "Okay, let's do it, right?" They didn't rush in. That's not who they were. First came the recon. They kept to their routines: work, class, home. But at night, when the city was asleep, they were wide awake, quietly slipping out, taking walks past Ted's new place, watching, observing, cataloging every movement. Ted had shacked up with his gang in a bungalow that looked like it belonged in a war zone, half the windows cracked, trash spilling out the back, and the unmistakable stench of bad decisions. It didn't take long to confirm the rumors. Ted and his boys were dealing, nothing huge, but enough to make the cops look the other way in exchange for peace on the streets. They weren't afraid of police. They were afraid of rivals. That was the opening my dad needed. While Rick sketched floor plans from memory, Dad went to visit the old fort. Now this is where the story turns legendary. Back in high school, Dad and Rick had built a fort deep in the woods behind the city dump. And not just some little shack, this was a 2-man bunker, insulated with scrap metal, insulated bricks, and duct tape. It had a wood stove made from a barrel, reinforced walls, and secret compartments for hiding whatever they didn't want found. They went back there, dusted it off, and began the rebuild. From the dump, they scavenged old clothes, cracked shoes, Halloween masks, broken baseball bats, and the DA, to busted-up bicycles that they turned into revenge cycles, mounted bat holders, silenced pedals, camouflage paint. These things weren't made for commuting. They were made for war. Next came the alibi. Dad and Rick were already liked by their neighbors. They'd fixed leaky faucets, helped carry groceries, even rewired a busted hallway light. So when they came home every evening and said goodnight to Mrs. Delgado across the hall, or nodded to the building clerk at the main desk, nobody thought twice. What no one knew was that they had a rope knotted and hidden hanging just outside their 3rd-story window, right above the alley dumpster. When midnight came, they'd lock the door, turn off the lights, and vanish into the shadows. Ted never saw it coming. That first night, Dad and Rick crept up to Ted's van. They took the lug nuts off the wheels just enough to cause a failure, but not enough to notice at a glance. Then they spray-painted the van with a symbol used by a rival gang. Something sloppy, just enough to stir confusion. They watched from across the street with homemade periscopes, waiting for the right moment. And when Ted stumbled into bed, high and drunk, snoring like a chainsaw, they made their move. The window to his room was half open. They slid in like ghosts, locked the door, jammed it with a chair, and then crack. The sound of wood striking bone is something you don't forget. They didn't go for the face. They went for the knees both at once, then the arms, over and over until Ted's screams turned into girl. He didn't fight back, he couldn't, and just when he thought it was over, came the final insult. A bag filled with fresh, warm, human shit, dumped straight onto his face, and then they were gone. Out the window, down the alley, on the bikes, disappeared into the night like urban phantoms. Ted's friends tried to carry him to the hospital in that sabotaged van. The wheels came off mid. An ambulance had to be called. By the time the sirens showed up, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. Ted's kneecaps were shattered. Doctors said he'd need a cane for the rest of his life. Justice, maybe. Revenge, definitely. But this was just the beginning. Revenge doesn't ignite in one moment. It builds, smolders, gathers, weight, like a storm, until there's no more room left to hold it. For my dad, that spark lit up the second he heard the police say the words, "There's nothing we can do." He didn't scream, didn't flip the hospital tray or curse the ceiling. He just went quiet. That dangerous kind of quiet where every second is a calculation. He was going to heal, and when he did, something was going to burn. But he couldn't do it alone. That's where Rick came in. Rick wasn't just some tag-along buddy. He was the kind of friend who'd dig a hole for no questions asked. They'd grown up side by side, built things from trash, shared bruises and bad ideas. If there was anyone who'd understand the kind of justice my dad needed, it was him. When my dad told Rick the whole story, every gut punch, every kick to the ribs, he didn't get mad, he just nodded. Then he said, "We'll need tools." From that moment on, it wasn't just a revenge plan, it was a project, a mission, and they treated it like professionals. No emotion, just logistics. First came the blueprint, how to get in and out without being seen. They chose their apartment for a reason, top floor, only one way in or out, and a clerk at the door who clocked every movement. Everyone in the building knew my dad and Rick. They were the good guys, the ones who fixed leaky sinks and rewired old lamps. No one suspected them of anything. That was key. They made sure every night played out the same. Come home before dark, chat with the clerk, greet the neighbors, lock the door, let people hear them, let the apartment come alive with the sound of dishes, the buzz of a radio, make it known they were home, inside, asleep. But they weren't. At midnight, they'd lower a rope, they'd nod themselves hidden during the day behind a gutter pipe. They'd scale down 3 stories into the alley, land softly on the trash bags, and vanish into the dark. No fire escape, no footsteps, just shadows slipping into the city's veins. Next came the materials. My dad's connection to the city dump came in handy. His father, my grandfather, had worked there for years. As a teen, Dad used to sneak in after hours, digging through junk with his friends, salvaging tools, scraps, treasures. They'd built a hidden fort in the woods nearby a fortress, really complete with a wood stove, secret compartments, and enough insulation to keep warm even in December. That old fort became the staging ground. Night after night, they raided the dump, found 2 broken down bikes, patched them up with pieces of others. No reflectors, no shiny paint, just matte black and silence. They added mounts to carry baseball bats, tucked knives into bags, and even rigged up homemade periscopes for surveillance. These weren't joyrides, these were weapons on wheels. And then came the masks. Halloween leftovers, grotesque, grinning faces that hid everything but the eyes. They even coated the inside with a bit of ammonia to keep from fogging up when they breathed. It was creepy, practical, perfect. But even with all the tools, all the tricks, the most important thing they had was time. They didn't strike right away. For weeks, they watched, studied, stalked. Ted's routine was easy to map. Late nights, drug deals, cheap liquor, stumbling home. His gang was just as sloppy, loud, predictable. My dad and Rick would crouch behind trash bins or lay flat on rooftops, noting every move. Who left, who stayed, when the lights went out. Every step of the plan was rehearsed at the fort. From the bike route to the window entry, they practiced until every move was muscle memory. Because when it came time to act, there could be no hesitation. There is a kind of peace that comes when you've decided to do something terrible and accepted it. That's where my dad was. He wasn't thinking about forgiveness. He wasn't interested in letting karma take the wheel. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the people Ted had stomped on, all the others who'd walked away from their own beatings, ashamed, alone, and unheard. So my dad wasn't just seeking revenge. He was delivering a message. And when that night finally came, the night they made Ted scream so loud his crew thought a rival gang had broken in, there was no anger left. Just execution. They didn't speak, didn't gloat. They just did what had to be done, and vanished into the night. Long before my dad became a quiet storm of revenge, he was just a kid playing in junk. The city dump wasn't a place most people visited voluntarily. It stank, it buzzed with flies, and half the time you were at risk of stepping on a rusted nail. But for my dad and Rick, it was like a hardware store where everything was free if you didn't mind a little tetanus. They spent their teenage years knee-deep in trash, pulling out old toasters, broken TVs, scraps of metal, busted wheels. It was chaos, but to them, it was treasure. And buried in that mess was something else. Possibility. They built their first real project out there, a fort hidden in the woods just beyond the dump's chain link fence. Most kids nailed a few boards together and called it a clubhouse. My dad and Rick built a fortress. They scavenged bricks to create insulated walls, found an old metal barrel and turned it into a makeshift wood stove with a real chimney. It had a lockable door, a fireproof roof, and even a little table made from a broken street sign. They'd camp out there for nights on end, pretending there were soldiers, spies, bandits, whatever the moment called for. But now, years later, it wasn't pretended anymore. That old fort, forgotten and rotting, was about to become their war room. Once they decided to hit Ted back, the first stop they made was to check if the fort still stood. It did, weakened, but still there, like it had been waiting for them. They got to work immediately, reinforcing the walls, clearing out the leaves and mold, fixing up the stove. No one knew about it but them, and it was far enough off the path that no one would stumble across it accidentally. It was perfect. From then on, every piece of the plan ran through that fort. The frames were stripped, repainted with dull matte tones. The chains were greased until they were silent. Reflectors were popped off and replaced with black tape. They added mounts using old clamps so they could carry bats, bags, and ropes without jangling or slowing down. One even had a small wooden box strapped to the back just big enough for their grotesque bag of terror. They dubbed them Revenge. These weren't for escaping. They were for striking fast, quiet, gone before anyone even blinked. Then came the disguises. They found 2 old Halloween masks, twisted, grinning faces with peeling paint and hollow eyes. They were dirty and stank like mildew, but after a little fixing up, they looked nightmarish. They modified them with straps and lined the inside with cloth so they could wear them comfortably without slipping. My dad even rigged one with a pair of old sunglasses lenses inside to keep the glare down. The clothes came next. Oversized hoodies, loose pants, gloves with the fingertips cut off. Everything designed to obscure shape and movement. Nothing too distinct, just shadows in the dark. But the most chilling detail. They rehearsed everything, over and over, night after night. They acted it all out at the fort. From putting on the gear in the right order, to lifting the bikes silently, to swinging the bats with perfect aim. They practiced climbing down rope, jumping into soft landings, mounting the revenge cycles and vanishing into the woods without leaving a trace. They treated it like a military op, because to them, it was. The fort wasn't just a base, it was their sanctuary, their forge. Each night they spent there, the plan got tighter, the stakes got higher. And beneath it all was a simmering sense of justice. Ted thought he'd broken my dad, left him crumpled in an alley with no fight left. But he was wrong, because every tool built in that dump, every log thrown into that stove, every pedal turned on those Frankenstein bikes, it was all lit by the same spark. They didn't know how it would all play out. They didn't have a clear ending in mind. All they knew was this: Ted had started something, and they were going to finish it. If you're going to get away with something bold, something illegal, something violent, you don't just need a plan. You need a story. One that people believe without hesitation. One that sounds so normal, so boring, that no one ever questions it. My dad and Rick knew that. That's why before they even picked up a bat or touched a spray can, they laid the groundwork for the perfect alibi. Because getting revenge wasn't just about payback, it was about walking away clean. The apartment they shared was on the top floor of a crumbling 3-story building. The kind of place where the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbors sneeze. That turned out to be a blessing. Everyone on their floor knew them. Dad had a habit of helping out the elderly lady next door with her groceries. Rick once fixed the toilet in the apartment across the hall. They weren't just tenants. They were the nice guys, the ones people liked. So they leaned into that. Every night, they came home from work or class around the same time. They'd say hello to the building clerk at the front desk, a guy who always kept a little notebook on who came and went, just in case there was trouble. They made sure to chat with him long enough for him to remember the interaction. Then, they'd head up the stairs, waving to whichever neighbors happened to have their doors open. Sometimes they brought food like they were just coming back from a late dinner. Other times, they'd be carrying something from the store. Nothing suspicious, just visible. Back inside their apartment, they kept things loud enough to be heard. A small radio playing soft music. Sometimes, Rick would intentionally bang apart or walk heavily on the floors, just for that added effect. They'd talk loud enough for voices to carry through the paper-thin walls. One time, Dad even coughed loud enough to make sure the neighbor on the other side would ask if he was okay the next morning. That's how deep they went. But of course, all of that was just the opening act. The real trick was getting out, without being seen. The window in their apartment opened up to the alley behind the building right above the dumpsters. There were no balconies, no fire escapes, and no reason anyone would expect someone to climb out of it. But Dad and Rick had a plan. They used a thick, knotted rope they'd salvaged from the dump and tied it securely inside the window frame. During the day, it was hidden behind a loose gutter pipe, tucked out of sight. At night, once the building went quiet, they'd open the windows slowly and lower the rope. One after the other, they climbed down. Quiet, controlled. They'd practiced this dozens of times at the fort. No clumsy falls, no noise, just soft landings on the bags of trash stacked below. Once they were on the ground, they'd vanish into the night bikes waiting nearby. Gear packed, everything ready. And in the morning, they came back the same way. Before sunrise, they'd stash the bikes and gear, hiked back to the building, and climbed the rope again. The timing had to be perfect before anyone was up, before the city really came alive. Once back in their apartment, they'd pull the rope in, coil it up, and tuck it beneath a sink in a sealed container. Then they'd go back to being the same two guys everyone knew. Making coffee, taking out the trash, smiling at the neighbors. Even the rope had a cover story. One morning Rick walked out with a garbage bag and accidentally dropped the rope in with the trash. Just a tangle of old fibers, frayed and stained. No one thought twice. It was gone with the rest of the building's waste. Before anyone could even connect the dots. By the time the police came asking questions days later, they had no reason to be suspicious. The clerk vouched for them. So did the neighbors. Everyone agreed. Dad and Rick had been home all night. The plan had worked, because the perfect alibi isn't just about having people lie for you. It's about making sure no one ever has a reason to doubt you in the first place.
Once the groundwork was laid and the alibi airtight, my dad and Rick turned their focus to the enemy. He wasn't just some thug anymore. He was a ticking time bomb wrapped in beer cans and bad decisions, living in a squatter's paradise with a crew of equally dangerous dropouts. Their base of operations, a battered old bungalow that reeked of mold, smoke, and cheap aftershave. It sat half-sunk on a cracked street in one of the roughest parts of the city. Windows boarded, lawn dead, a satellite dish held up by duct tape. Ted, to most people, that house screamed, "Stay away!" But for Dad and Rick, it was ground zero. They spent days observing. No gear, no weapons, just eyes and notebooks. They'd sit at a bus stop across the street, pretending to read, tracking who came and went. They made late-night strolls, often looping past the house from different angles. Sometimes they'd split up, one in the alley, one on the rooftop of an abandoned store down the block watching. They noted everything, Ted's movements, his cruise patterns, when deliveries happened, who looked armed, who looked high, who passed out in the living room. It was all logged. Most nights, the same routine played out. Ted and his cronies would hang out on the crumbling porch, drinking, smoking, throwing bottle caps into the gutter. Music blared through cracked windows. Occasionally, someone would show up to make a shady exchanger, quick handshake and a bulging pocket, walking away. But the key intel, they were sloppy. Security was non-existent. No one locked the side windows. No one paid attention to sounds outside. And every time a car drove by, they just ducked and waited, like scared animals used to being hunted. That fear was useful. Rick even went so far as to dress up in a hoodie and walk up the street pretending to be a dealer from another block. No one questioned it. In fact, they barely looked up. That confirmed something important. Ted wasn't expecting a fight. He thought the beating he gave my dad was the final word. He thought Dad was done. That illusion, it was the most dangerous thing Ted had. So my dad exploited it. They focused on Ted's bedroom. It was on the far left side of the house. Based on the layout they had pieced together. The window faced the alley, partially hidden by an old oak tree. Perfect cover. One night, Rick got close enough to peek through a crack in the curtain and saw him snoring like a lumber mill. Bottle on the floor. TV still playing static. They knew then. Ted was vulnerable. The next step was testing the house. Late one night, they crept through the back alley, climbed the fence, and slashed 2 tires on an old rusted-out Buick parked in the yard. Then they spray-painted a rival gang's insignia on the van. That was Ted's pride and joy. Just enough to stir paranoia. When Ted saw it in the morning, he exploded. Neighbors said he shouted about those bastards from 9th Street. He was rattled, paranoid, and that made him dangerous but also predictable. Dad and Rick let a few more days go by, giving him time to spiral. They watched as he barked orders at his crew, demanded extra locks on the front door, even started carrying a bat around inside the house, but he never once checked his window. That told them everything. The window would be their way in. The inside of the house would be chaos. But Ted's room, that would be the quiet before the storm. They built black-painted periscopes from old piping and mirrors they found in the dump, letting them peek over fences or around corners without being seen. They used those to monitor every inch of that alley, making sure no patrols came by, no nosy neighbors peeked through their curtains. Every time they passed a test, every time they got closer, without being caught, their confidence grew. The final nights were spent doing dry runs. They'd leave the fort, gear up, ride the Revenger cycles silently through the city, approach the house from 3 different directions, and time themselves. They got the route down to 7 minutes flat. Every risk was measured, every variable accounted for. By the end of that week, they knew Ted's house better than Ted did. Where the floorboards creaked, which rooms were always empty, which lights were never turned on. Ted didn't know it, but he was already surrounded. The scouting was done. Now all that was left was to make him scream.
They picked the night like a sniper picks a shot, patient, precise, unshakably certain. It was a Friday. The city buzzed with its usual blend of chaos and static. Sirens in the distance, drunks spilling out of bars, radios humming through open windows. No one noticed 2 dark figures gliding through back streets on modified bicycles, their wheels whispering against cracked pavement. My dad and Rick had done this route so many times it felt like muscle memory. No talking, no glances, just motion. They were ghosts. They rode low and fast, their disguises already on torn hoodies, gloves, and those grotesque Halloween masks with the gnarled smiles and dead eyes. Behind them, the streets yawned, empty. Ahead of them, the bungalow sat in quiet decay, like a toothless predator slow to bite back. They ditched the bikes in a shadowy spot behind a boarded-up shed 2 blocks away. No tire marks, no reflective gear. They weren't leaving anything behind. Crouching low, they made their way through side alleys and yards, moving like wolves on a hunt. The window to Ted's bedroom was right where it always was, half open, curtain fluttering slightly in the warm night breeze. Just like clockwork, the house throbbed with muffled music and thick laughter. Ted and his gang were drunk, high loud, just the way my dad had hoped. They'd prepped for every detail. Hours earlier, before even approaching the house, they de-slipped in unnoticed and loosened the lug nuts on 2 of the Van S wheels, the same van they'd already tagged with a fake rival gang symbol earlier that week. It was just enough to cause a breakdown, but not enough for anyone to notice until it was too late. Everything was in place. Now it was time. They watched from a distance, timing the moment. Ted finally stumbled into his room, alone, slumped onto the mattress like a sack of potatoes, shoes on, bottle in hand. He passed out within minutes, snoring like a busted engine. That was the signal. Rick boosted Dad up to the window. Slowly, silently, my dad slipped inside. Years of gym classes and climbing junkyard frames had given him the strength to move with eerie grace. He didn't creak a single floorboard. Once inside, he unlocked the window from within and helped Rick slide through. In less than 20 seconds, they were both in the lion's den. They locked the bedroom door behind them. Quiet click, then slid a wooden chair from the corner and jammed it under the doorknob, barricading them in. They approached the bed in unison, moving like soldiers, clearing a room. The bats were already in hand, each one wrapped in cloth to muffle the impact. And then, crack! 2 baseball bats came down in perfect sync, both knee. Ted's body arched off the bed, his scream choked by shock and pain. Before he could move, they hit him again. One arm raised to block the blow's crack. There went the forearm. The other arm reached for the nightstand, cracked, shattered at the elbow. He was no longer fighting, just convulsing. They didn't say a word, didn't yell, didn't threaten. They just acted. And then, the final touch. Out came the plastic bag they'd carried in Rick's pack. Sealed, still warm. It was full of human shit, their own carefully collected offering of humiliation. My dad told me it was the part he hated the most, but also the part he knew had to happen. As Ted whimpered on the mattress, bleeding and broken, they opened the bag and dumped its contents straight onto his face. He screamed again, this time in horror, choking, gagging, flailing pointlessly with ruined limbs. They didn't wait to watch. The house was already starting to stir. Someone pounded on the locked door, voices shouting, confused, what the hell's going on? My dad and Rick were already at the window. In seconds they were out just as fast as they came in. Through the alley, down the street, mounted the bikes like they were born riding. But they didn't take the same path back. They peeled off into a new route they'd mapped in advance, zigzagging through side roads and deserted lanes until they reached the abandoned lot behind the old mechanic's shop. There they dismounted, stashed the bikes under a tarp hidden in an old doghouse, and vanished into the dark. The rest played out almost exactly how they hoped. Ted's crew, still too messed up to call the cops, tried to haul him into the van to get him to the hospital. But as they pulled out of the driveway, the sabotaged wheels gave way. The van lurched sideways and collapsed with a metallic groan. Panicked, they had no choice but to call an ambulance. That meant the cops showed up, and that's when things really unraveled. When the police came to take Ted's statement, they noticed two of the guys looked strung out. One had a suspicious bulge in his coat, a quick pat down, a stash of pills, an arrest that led to more searches. One by one, Ted's cronies started dropping. Some got charged, others ran. A few disappeared without a trace. But the most satisfying part, Ted, the doctors said both of his kneecaps were shattered. His arms were mangled, nerve damage in one leg. Recovery would take years if ever. He'd walk with a cane for the rest of his life. And in his dazed, doped-up state, all he kept mumbling about was a Gangsom rival crew he thought had finally come for him. That's what my dad wanted, to make him scared of shadows, to make him watch his back for the rest of his life. The cops did knock on Dad and Rick's door eventually. They asked some questions, took a look around, but the story held. Neighbors vouched. The clerk swore they hadn't left. The apartment was clean. No evidence, not even a trace. Everything had been burned or buried: bats, masks, clothes. Even the bikes were dismantled and scattered in different dump sites. The rope dropped in the trash and hauled off before morning. As far as the world knew, my dad and Rick had nothing to do with it. And Ted, he never came near them again. He left the city a year later, paranoid and limping. The revenge was brutal, ugly, unforgivable in the eyes of the law. But it worked. Because sometimes, when the world refuses to balance the scales, you've got to do it yourself. Revenge, no matter how justified, doesn't come without fallout. Ted was broken physically, mentally, emotionally. But he wasn't the only one who paid a price. In the days following the attack, rumors swept through the neighborhood like wildfire. No one knew exactly what happened inside that bungalow, but everyone heard the screams. Everyone saw the ambulance lights bouncing off the cracked windows and rusted-out van. Everyone whispered the same thing. Ted finally got what was coming to, but no one said it out loud. Not to the cops, not to each other. Because in neighborhoods like that, silence wasn't just survival, it was sacred. While Ted recovered under heavy sedation, his crew started to unravel. One guy didn't try to act tough, like it was all just a scare, but he was the first to get caught. Cops found pills in his jacket when they came to question the group at the hospital. He got arrested on the spot. That opened the door to search his stuff, his car, then the house. What the police found was enough to spark a deeper investigation. Some of the smarter guys in Ted's circle got spooked and moved their stash elsewhere. So when the cops raided the bungalow, they only found residue in a few small bags. Nothing major, but it was enough to put pressure on the crew, and Ted wasn't exactly in shape to run damage control. The gang fractured quickly. A couple of the guys skipped town, gone overnight. No forwarding address, no goodbyes, just gone. But there were still a few stubborn ones. Dad and Rick weren't finished with them. The mission wasn't just about Ted, it was about ending the threat entirely. So they waited. Another week passed before they made their move. This time, no rope, no alley climb. Just the revenge cycles, the masks, and a prop that looked real enough to terrify anyone. A steel toy revolver with weight, shining just enough menace and low light to pass as the real thing. They tracked 3 of the remaining guys to a back alley known for petty drug deals and stashed goods. They waited in the dark, watching, breathing, waiting for the right moment. Then they pounced. Rick came out first, gun drawn, pointed, unflinching. Don't move. Dad followed with a bat, eyes cold behind that plastic mask. The 3 thugs froze. No fight, just fear. My dad disarmed them one by one, took their knives, emptied their pockets, made them kneel. No one moved. No one blinked. They didn't know if that gun was real, but they weren't about to find out the hard way. Then came the message. Rick kept the gun trained while Dad stepped forward. This is your last chance. Leave town. Don't talk. Don't ask questions. If you breathe the wrong way, the next visit won't end with a warning. They didn't believe him at first, so Dad added emphasis. He doused one guy's sneaker in lighter fluid and struck a match. The guy panicked, screamed, tried to rip the shoe off. His flames licked up his leg. He kicked it off just in time, still shrieking, eyes wide with terror. Message received, that was all it took. Within a week, the rest of Ted's crew disappeared. No more porch drinking. No more threats. No more sideways glances. The neighborhood breathed easier, even if no one knew exactly who to thank. And Teddy stayed indoors. Word was, he slept with the lights on, kept a bat next to his bed, refused to talk about what happened. Some said he thought the rival gang that tagged his van was still out there, hunting him. Others said he thought ghosts were following him. Either way, he was finished. And my dad, he never said a word. Not to the police, not to his neighbors, not even to me, until years later. Because even though the job was done, the damage lingered. He knew he'd crossed a line that most people never even get close to. And while part of him felt justified and maybe even satisfied, another part of him would always carry the weight. He didn't want revenge to become who he was. He just wanted peace, and in his own way, he got it. By the time the gang was down to its last legs, Ted's little empire had turned into a house of cards on a windy day. The bungalow was quieter now. No more music shaking the walls. No more late-night shouting. Just paranoia and the smell of old beer and desperation. But my dad wasn't done. There was still unfinished business. A few of Ted's cronies hadn't taken the hint. They hadn't left town. Maybe they thought the danger had passed. Maybe they were too stupid or too stubborn to believe they were targets. Dad and Rick wanted to make sure they understood. This wasn't about making another scene. It wasn't about beating anyone half to death. This was about fear. Cold, deep, unforgettable fear. So they staged one final show. They tracked two of the stragglers, guys who had been seen around their usual back alley, trying to rebuild some kind of operation. They were sloppy, always had been. Same spot, same time. It was almost like they were begging for trouble. And trouble came, late at night, dressed in their gear and mounted on the revenge cycles. My dad and Rick circled the block 3 times before moving in. They approached from opposite ends of the alley, closing the trap like wolves closing on a wounded deer. The men never even saw it coming. Rick stepped out first, toy revolver in hand. It looked real in the dark, cold metal glint, heavy barrel pointed straight at the guy in front. Down on your knees now. The thug froze, eyes wide, mouth hanging open. He dropped to the pavement. The other guy reached for something, maybe a knife, maybe just his nerve. Bad move. My dad stepped out from behind him with the bat, slammed it hard into a dumpster beside his head, metal on metal. The sound like a gunshot. That was enough. The second guy dropped to his knees, hands in the air, shaking. Smart choice. My dad growled through the mask. Rick held the gun steady while Dad walked a slow circle around them, speaking low and deliberate. You think this is over? You think we forgot what you did? You hurt people. You broke lives. And you're still out here, acting like it doesn't matter. Neither man said a word. They didn't dare. Dad stopped, looked at one of them. I want you to remember this night every time you think about staying here. Every time you open your mouth, or look at someone the wrong way. He took out the lighter fluid. One of the guys started to protest, a whisper of pleas that never got finished. Dad doused his right shoe. Not too much, just enough. Then he struck the match. The guy screamed before the flame even touched leather. The fire flared, hot and bright for a few terrifying seconds, climbing up the laces. The thug panicked, flailed, screamed as he kicked the flaming sneaker off into the alley. My dad didn't move, just watched. Rick, never dropping the act, leaned in. Next time, it's not your shoe. The two men got the message. That was it. No punches thrown, no bones broken. Just fear. Pure and raw. The two thugs fled the city within days. One was last seen catching a bus out of state. The other, nobody really knows. He vanished. Some say he went underground. Others say he never stopped running. Either way, Ted's circle was shattered. My dad and Rick made one final ride back to the fort. No victory cheers. No just silence and the sound of tires rolling over old gravel. They took apart the bikes, dismantled every piece. Screws, bolts, chains all separated. They buried some parts, burned others. The barrels of the stove turned red hot that night, swallowing evidence, memories, and the last traces of their vengeance. The masks were tossed into the flames, the gloves, the clothes, even the shoes gone, the toy gun thrown deep into the dump, never to be found. They walked home as the first hints of morning cracked over the skyline, slipping back into their apartment like shadows melting into light. When the police came knocking again, just one more round of routine questions, they opened the door without hesitation, smiled, answered, let them look around. There was nothing to find. Neighbors backed them up. The clerk swore they'd been home. And Ted, he refused to talk to police. Too scared. Too broken. Still convinced a rival gang had come for him. That was the final gift Dad gave him. The fear of enemies that didn't exist. Shadows he could never shake. He walked with a cane after that. Moved with a limp. And eventually he left town altogether. Gone. Erased. Not by the law, but by the very people he once thought were powerless. My dad never gloated, he never bragged, he just closed that chapter, burned it to ash and carried the weight in silence, because revenge might settle the score, but it never leaves you untouched. The final step wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud or violent, but it was just as important as the night Ted got his legs shattered. It was cleanup, because even the perfect revenge leaves behind crumbs if you're not careful. And my dad, he was very, very careful. After that last scare in the alley, Dad and Rick went into full erasure mode. They knew the cops would come knocking again if, not with accusations, then with suspicions. They couldn't risk a single thread unraveling the entire plan. So, piece by piece, they made everything disappear. First the revenge site. Those bikes had carried them across the city like silent predators, but now they were a liability. They disassembled them completely, tires, frames, chains, seats, all taken apart with care. They stashed different parts in different dumpsters across town, making sure nothing ended up in one place. Some of it went into the dump during a visit to Grandpa. Other pieces were thrown into alley bins, never to be seen again. The weapons the bats had already served their purpose. They were burned to the fort. Brick by brick, they fed the flames until all that remained were ash and memory. The same went for the masks, gloves, and clothes they wore. Anything that could link them to that night disappeared in smoke. Even the rope that knotted escape ladder was handled with surgical precision. After their last descent, they pulled it back through the window, coiled it tight, and stuffed it into a garbage bag. The next morning, Rick casually dropped it in the dumpster while taking out the trash. Nothing suspicious, just two roommates doing their chores. As for the toy gun, that was tossed deep into the dump somewhere among thousands of pounds of trash, indistinguishable from real metal junk. By the time anyone might have found it, it would have been rusted, buried, or crushed beyond recognition. Inside the apartment, everything was spotless. No tools, no leftover scraps, not even a streak of paint. They scrubbed every corner, vacuumed every fiber, made sure their home looked exactly like what the cops already believed it was. Boring, ordinary, clean, and it worked. When the detectives returned for one final look, they found nothing. No rope, no gear, no trace. Neighbors were firm in their alibis. The clerk confirmed their comings and goings. And just like that, the case went cold. Ted never pointed fingers, he was too convinced the gang had marked him for death. His silence sealed the deal. My dad and Rick had pulled it off. Not just the revenge, but the escape. They hadn't just beaten the devil, they'd made him think someone else had. The knock came at 10 a.m. sharp. My dad said he knew immediately. There was no mistaking that rhythm. Not a neighbor asking to borrow sugar. Not a landlord checking the plumbing, it was the cops. Rick glanced at him from across the room. They didn't say a word, they didn't have to. Everything that needed doing had already been done. Dad opened the door with a calm smile. Two detectives stood there. One tall and tired look, the other younger, sharper eyes scanning everything before they even stepped inside. Just a few questions, they said. Dad nodded. Sure, come on in. The place was spotless, normal, almost boring. Dishes in the sink, textbooks on the table, a radio playing quietly in the background. Nothing out of place, nothing that screamed we destroyed a man last week. The detectives asked the usual. Where were you on the night of the incident? Did you know Ted? Had you had any contact with him recently? Dad played it cool. Said he hadn't seen Ted in months. That he'd heard the rumors, that it was a shame what happened to him. But no, he and Rick had been home that night, just like every night. And that was the truth. Technically, the cops pressed harder, asking about the fort, the dump, the bikes, anything that might raise a red flag. Dad just shrugged. I haven't ridden a bike in years, he said. You can ask the clerk. We were in all night. And that's what really saved them, the alibi. The building clerk backed him up. The neighbors backed them up. No one had seen them leave. No one heard anything suspicious. They were the nice guys, the helpful guys, the quiet ones who kept to themselves. The detectives looked around the apartment one last time. No rope, no gear, no masks, nothing. They didn't even bother to open the closet. After 20 minutes they left. No charges, no follow-up. And that was it. The final test passed. The last loose end tied. Later that day, my dad looked out the window and saw one of the detectives talking to a neighbor on the street. The cop didn't look frustrated, just resigned, like he knew he was missing something but couldn't prove a damn thing. Because there was nothing to prove. Everything was gone. Everything had burned. And the story that remained, it was airtight. Ted's silence born from fear only helped, because even if he had suspected, even if some deep part of him guessed the truth, he never told a soul. He didn't dare. Years passed before my dad ever told the story. It wasn't something he bragged about. He didn't carry it like a trophy. He carried it like a scar, silent, hidden, but always there. The night he told me, we were just sitting on the porch. I had been joking about the chaos I left behind at my mom's house, silly pranks, petty revenge, nothing that left bruises. We laughed, and for a second, it felt like a victory. Then he got quiet, real quiet. He leaned back, looked out over the lawn, and said, "Let me tell you something, kid. You think you're wild?" And then he told me everything, every step, every shadow, every bone-breaking strike, every whisper of fire and fear. He laid it all out, like he was unloading a weight he'd carried too long. By the time he finished, I wasn't laughing anymore. He wasn't proud, but he wasn't sorry either. He told me he felt justified, that Ted had it coming, and then some, that what they did wasn't just revenge, it was survival, a message, a line drawn in blood that said, this far, no farther. But he also told me something else, something I've never forgotten. He said, vengeance doesn't end when the screaming stops. It sticks with you, it follows you, and some nights it doesn't let you sleep. He never got caught, never saw a courtroom, never faced a consequence from the world, but that didn't mean there weren't consequences. He still dreamed about the beating, not the one he gave, but the one he took. He remembered waking up on the cold ground, blood pooling, stars blinking above him like they didn't care. He remembered the silence afterward, the police brushing him off, the pain, the helplessness, and even after all the planning, all the perfect execution, even after Ted vanished like smoke in the wind, the rage didn't go away. It just went quiet. He told me that was the scariest part. Not the revenge, not the blood, but how easy it was to do once he decided, how natural it felt. And that's why he never told anyone but me and his younger brother. He didn't want to wear it like a badge. He didn't want anyone thinking it was cool or badass or heroic, because it wasn't. It was necessary, maybe, but it wasn't clean. And that's why, when he finished his story, he looked me dead in the eye and said, never do what I did. Never go that far. You don't come back the same. And I believed him, because behind his calm voice and steady hands, I saw something else. A flicker, a glimpse of the fire that once burned so hot, it turned fear into ashes. And that's when I realized the real cost of revenge. It's not the risk. It's what it leaves behind inside you. After my dad told me everything, he didn't speak for a long while. Just sat there, staring at nothing, like he was watching ghosts walk across the yard. That silence told me more than the story ever could. He didn't need to say he changed after what he did. I could see it. The way his jaw tightened when people talked about justice. The way he avoided violence on TV. The way he never raised his voice of him when he had every reason to. He'd gone to a dark place and came back, but something had stayed behind in the shadows. A part of him, the part that taught a bully to fear shadows. The part that proved justice wasn't always about courts and laws, it was sometimes a fire lit in secret. And somewhere along the way, that legacy trickled into me. No, I never went as far as he did, but I understood where my sharpness came from. My instinct to push back, my need to fight when things felt unfair. The gnome pranks, the bathroom sabotage, the chaos I left in evil Mama Bear's house before I moved out. It wasn't just spite. It was a spark. I got it from him, but I also got the wisdom not to let it consume me, because my dad didn't just pass down the fire. He passed down the warning. He made sure I knew that revenge, when it's your only focus, eats away at your soul, and that once you cross certain lines, there's no erasing the footprints you leave behind. So I took the lesson, all of it, the anger, the pain, the strategy, the discipline, the restraint. I understood why he never wanted to tell anyone else. And I also understood why he told me, because legacies aren't just about what you inherit. They're about what you choose to carry forward. And I choose to carry the fire carefully, Some revenge stories fade. Others burn into your blood. If this one made your jaw drop, you haven't heard the half of what's out there. Hit that like button, subscribe, and stick around because the next story, it might just make this one look like a warm-up. Stay sharp.